Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Boss Economics World, where we rip through the headlines, shred the spin, and expose the economic disasters your governments are cooking up, because let's face it, they're not just bad chefs, they're arsonists in the kitchen of global finance. I'm your host, the Boss, here to serve you a piping hot plate of economic truth, with a side of sarcasm and a garnish of cold, hard data. Today, we're diving headfirst into the latest G7 circus, summit, where the world's so-called economic leaders spent 3 days in Banff, Canada, patting each other on the back while the global economy teeters on the edge of a cliff. Buckle up, folks, because this one's a doozy. Oh, the G7. That exclusive club of the world's richest democracies, the US, UK, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, and Japan, where finance ministers and central bank governors gather to solve the world's problems, but somehow always end up making them worse. This time, they've issued a grand communique, dripping with vague promises and pointed fingers, all while conveniently ignoring the elephant in the room, or should I say, the dragon. Yes, folks, they're talking about China's non-market policies and excessive imbalances, without actually naming China, because apparently, calling out the second largest economy in the world by name is just too spicy for these delicate diplomatic taste buds. But let's not kid ourselves, this isn't just about China. This is about the G7's complete and utter failure to manage their own economies, their own policies, and their own backyards. They're pointing fingers at Beijing while their own houses are on fire, and guess what? They're the ones holding the matches. From tariff tantrums to supply chain meltdowns, from the Minimis smuggling scandals to sanctions on Russia that hurt their own citizens more than Moscow, the G7 is a masterclass in economic mismanagement. And today, we're going to dissect this mess from point to surface, exposing the real economic issues behind their fancy words, and showing you how their incompetence is dragging us all into a recessionary abyss. So, grab your popcorn, or your pitchforks, because it's time to get mad, get informed, and get ready to demand better. Let's start with the headline grabber, the G7's pledge to address excessive imbalances in the global economy, which is code for China's doing bad stuff, and we're mad about it. Now, don't get me wrong, China's economic practices, like state subsidies, intellectual property theft, and currency manipulation, are real issues. According to the U.S. Trade Representative's 2023 report, China's non-market policies have cost American businesses over $600 billion annually in lost IP alone. And let's not forget the flood of cheap Chinese goods, often produced with state-backed overcapacity, that's drowning industries from steel to solar panels in places like the EU and the US. The OECD estimates that China's industrial subsidies are now twice the size of those in the rest of the world combined. Talk about an unfair playing field. But here's the kicker, folks, the G7's obsession with blaming China is a convenient distraction from their own failures. Take the US, for example. Under the Trump administration 2.0, we're seeing a revival of tariff wars, with threats of 60% tariffs on Chinese goods and 20% on everyone else, according to Bloomberg's latest projections. Sounds tough, right? Wrong. The Peterson Institute for International Economics estimates that these tariffs could cost American consumers $40 billion a year in higher prices, while doing little to dent China's export machine. And who's paying for that? You, the average Joe and Jane, at the checkout counter, while corporate profits soar. Meanwhile, Europe's not much better. Germany's industrial output is down 5.3% year-on-year as of Q1 2025, per Eurostat, partly because of over-reliance on Chinese supply chains they failed to diversify. So, G7, maybe stop whining about China's non-market practices and start fixing your own market failures, huh? Speaking of tariffs, let's talk about the elephant in the room, or rather, the donkey and the eagle fighting in the room. The G7 communique glosses over the acrimony between the US and its allies over Trump's trade policies, but let's not sugarcoat it, this is a full-blown diplomatic dumpster fire. A year ago, in Italy, the G7 was all about a free, fair, and rules-based multilateral system. Fast forward to Banff, and that pledge has been watered down to pursuing our shared policy objectives. Translation: the US is doing whatever it wants, and the rest of the G7 is too scared, or too complicit, to call it out. Now, Canadian Finance Minister François-Philippe Champagne wants us to believe this communique wasn't watered down to appease US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. Oh, come on, François. We're not that gullible. The US is pushing a protectionist agenda that's already tanking global trade. World trade volumes are projected to grow by just 1.7% in 2025, down from 3.4% pre-COVID, per the WTO, while Europe and Canada are stuck pretending they're on board. And let's not forget Japan, which is quietly ramping up its own subsidies to counter China, with 2 trillion yen, $13 billion, in new industrial support announced in March 2025, per Nikkei Asia. So much for a level playing field, huh, G7? Here's the real problem, folks, tariffs and protectionism don't fix imbalances, they create new ones. The IMF's latest World Economic Outlook warns that escalating trade tensions could shave 0.8% off global GDP by 2026, with advanced economies like the G7 taking the biggest hit. But hey, why let data get in the way of a good political stunt, right? The G7's hypocrisy is on full display here, and it's the ordinary taxpayer, you, who's footing the bill for their economic ego trips. Now, let's zoom in on one of the juiciest nuggets in the communique, the G7's sudden obsession with de minimis shipments, those low-value packages, often from Chinese e-commerce giants like Temu and Shein, that flood our markets duty-free. The communique warns these shipments are overwhelming customs, dodging taxes, and even smuggling drugs. And you know what? They're not wrong. According to a 2024 report by the U.S. Customs and Border Protection, de minimis shipments to the U.S. have skyrocketed from 140 million packages in 2015 to over 1 billion in 2023, with 60% originating from China. In the EU, the European Commission estimates these shipments cost member states €7 billion in lost tax revenue annually. And yes, there's a dark side. CBP seized over 27,000 shipments of fentanyl-laced packages in 2023 alone, most hidden in de minimis parcels. But here's the kicker, folks, this isn't a China problem, it's a G7 problem. Why? Because they created the rules that allow this madness. The US de minimis threshold is $800, meaning anything under that sails through without tariffs or taxes. In the EU, it's €150, but enforcement is so lax it's basically a free-for-all. These thresholds were designed decades ago to help small businesses, not to enable billion-dollar Chinese e-commerce empires to game the system. And what's the G7 solution? Oh, they're going to analyze it. Wow, such leadership. Meanwhile, your local retailers are going bankrupt. US retail bankruptcies hit a 5-year high in 2024, per S&P Global, because they can't compete with this flood of untaxed, unregulated junk. G7, you built this monster, and now you're clutching your pearls. Spare me. And then there's the Russia-Ukraine mess, where the G7 sanctimonious posturing reaches peak hypocrisy. The communique condemns Russia's continued brutal war and promises unwavering support for Ukraine, but notice what's missing. The word illegal. Yup, they couldn't even agree to call Russia's invasion illegal, because apparently, that's too divisive. And don't get me started on the sanctions circus. They're looking at options to ramp up sanctions on Russia if a ceasefire isn't reached, but they won't touch the price cap on Russian oil, which the UK and others want to lower. Why? Because it's not working, folks. Russia's oil revenues are up 30% year-on-year as of April 2025, per the IEA, thanks to a shadow fleet of tankers and cozy deals with India and China. Meanwhile, European consumers are paying €150 per megawatt-hour for energy, triple pre-war levels, because of these same sanctions. And here's the real kicker, the G7 is freezing Russia's sovereign assets in their jurisdictions, promising to use them to rebuild Ukraine. Sounds noble, right? Wrong. Legal experts, including those at the European Central Bank, warn this could set a dangerous precedent, undermining trust in Western financial systems. Emerging markets are already diversifying away from the dollar and euro. China's yuan now accounts for 4.5% of global payments, up from 1.9% in 2020, per SWIFT data, because they see the G7 weaponizing finance. So, congratulations, G7, you've not only failed to hurt Russia, but you've also hurt yourselves and scared off the rest of the world. Bravo! So, what's the big picture here, folks? The G7 is fiddling while the global economy burns, and their communique is nothing but a smokescreen for their incompetence. They blame China, but ignore their own policy failures. They cry about tariffs, but can't agree on free trade. They warn about supply chains, but won't fix their own rules. And they posture on Ukraine, but their sanctions are a boomerang hitting their own citizens. The result? A global economy on the brink of recession. The IMF's latest forecast pegs global growth at just 3.1% for 2025, the lowest in decades outside of crisis years, with advanced economies like the G7 growing at a pathetic 1.6%. Inflation is still sticky, 4.2% in the OECD as of Q1 2025, while unemployment is ticking up, with Eurozone jobless rates hitting 7.1%, per Eurostat. This, ladies and gentlemen, is what happens when you let governments and central bankers play economic Jenga with your future. They pull out the wrong blocks, blame everyone else, and then act surprised when the whole thing comes crashing down. But here at Boss Economics World, we see through the spin, and we're calling it out. So, to the G7, I say this, stop pointing fingers, start fixing problems, and for the love of all things holy, get your act together before you drag us all into an economic abyss. Alright, folks, that's it for today's episode of Boss Economics World, but don't just sit there fuming, get involved. Share this video with everyone you know, because the more people wake up to this economic clown show, the more pressure we can put on these so-called leaders to do their jobs. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Do you think the G7 is clueless, corrupt, or both? And if you're new here, smash that subscribe button and ring the bell, because we're just getting started exposing the economic disasters your governments don't want you to see. Until next time, stay sharp, stay mad, and remember, in this economic circus, you're the boss.